Somewhere in the dark between two stars, a voice stopped in the middle of a word, and for 2 full turns of the galaxy's slow clock, nobody noticed it had stopped. That was the strange part. In the caudral weave, nothing was supposed to go quiet without someone feeling it. Every mind in the weave was threaded to every other mind nearby, a soft hum of shared presence running under every thought, the way a heartbeat runs under song. When one voice dropped out of that hum, the others were supposed to feel the gap the way a tongue feels a missing tooth. That was the whole design of the thing. Nobody was ever supposed to be able to disappear quietly. The duty officer on Lantern 6 that night had a steady, unremarkable voice, the kind that had read out the same 6 words 1,000 times before without ever once stumbling over them. He liked the routine of it, if he thought about it at all, the small comfort of a sentence that always came out the same way, at the same hour, no matter what. Lantern 6 reporting. All threads steady. All hands. And then nothing. Not a scream. Not an alarm. Just silence, sitting where a sentence should have finished, patient and total, the way a held breath sits in a closed room. Ada Marsh did not know any of this yet. 90,000 kilometers away, on a small station called Lantern 9, she was kneeling in her garden box with dirt under her fingernails, humming an old tune with no one to hear it but herself, and she was, in that exact moment, entirely happy. Lantern 9 was not much to look at. It was a squat metal drum turning slowly in the dark, one long antenna reaching out like a fishing rod, and inside it, 3 small rooms that Ada had made into a home. There was a bunk, made up with a quilt she'd sewn herself out of old uniform fabric during her 2nd month alone. There was a galley the size of a closet, where a battered kettle sat permanently on the small burner, its handle wrapped in cloth tape because the original had cracked months ago and she'd never gotten around to replacing it. And there was the garden box, a shallow tray of soil under a grow light, where she kept 6 kinds of herbs, 2 stubborn tomato vines, and a patch of mint that had outgrown its space twice already and shown no sign of slowing down. She had been alone on Lantern 9 for 104 days. To most of the galaxy, that sentence alone would have sounded like the opening line of a tragedy. To Ada, it was simply Tuesday, and Tuesday meant tea, and the mint, and the long slow satisfaction of watching something grow because she had tended it well. She checked the mint, pinched back a leaf that had gone too woody, and rubbed it between her fingers just to smell it. Then she checked the tomatoes, which had once again decided to grow sideways instead of up, threading themselves along the edge of the box like they were trying to escape rather than climb. She'd given up correcting them weeks ago. If they wanted to grow strange, she'd decided, that was their business. She made her tea the way she always did, the kettle whistling thin and cheerful in the small metal room, spooning in exactly 1 measure of the dried leaves she'd brought from Earth in a tin that was, by now, more than half empty, a fact she tried not to think about too often. When the tin finally ran dry, she supposed she'd have to learn to like something the cordial trader sold instead, and some part of her already looked forward to it the way she looked forward to most small unknowns, with more curiosity than dread. She carried the cup with her on the short loop of the station she walked every morning, past the bunk, past the galley, into the control room where the beacon's long slow pulse ticked out across the dark like a lighthouse counting the seconds. Everything was steady. Everything was quiet. She liked it that way, had always liked it that way, long before any of this, back when the quiet she kept had nothing to do with the stars at all. She was halfway through her 2nd cup when the comm chimed, and the face of Juno Vell appeared on the small screen, framed by the soft blue light of the weave terminal on the other end. Juno was young for a Vellan liaison officer, still a little too eager, still not fully used to hiding what she felt. Her skin had the faint silver sheen common to her kind, and behind her eyes there was always a second layer of attention, the part of her that never stopped listening to the hum of her own weave even while she talked to someone outside it. Ada had noticed, over the months, that Juno's eyes moved differently than a human's, not shifting to look at things, but flickering, every few seconds, towards something that wasn't in the room at all. "Morning check," Juno said, the same way she opened every call. "How's the mint?" "Winning," Ada said. "I may need to declare a truce and let it have the whole box." Juno smiled, but it didn't quite reach the rest of her face. There was something distracted behind it, a flicker Ada had learned to notice over 4 months of these calls, the same flicker that meant Juno's attention was only half in the room with her. "Everything all right on your end?" Ada asked. "Fine. Probably fine." Juno glanced sideways at something off-screen, a habit Ada had come to recognize as her checking a second display, the way someone might glance at a phone buzzing in their pocket. Lantern 6 missed a chorus check last night, and another one this morning. "Is that unusual?" It's never happened before, Juno said. Not once, not in the whole life of the station. She said it lightly, the way people say things they are trying hard not to worry about out loud, her voice climbing just slightly at the end of the sentence. It's probably just the relay line. Old equipment, out that far. Things go quiet on old lines all the time. You don't sound like you believe that. Juno didn't answer right away, and in the silence, Ada could see the small crack forming, the first thin line in something that had looked solid a moment before. I'm sure it's nothing, Juno said finally. I'll let you know. The screen went dark, and Ada sat alone in her quiet control room, listening to the beacon's slow pulse, and for the first time in a long while, the silence around her did not feel entirely comfortable. To understand why one missed chorus check could put a knot in the stomach of an entire species, you first had to understand what the weave actually was, and Ada had spent her first months among the caudral learning it the slow way, one careful conversation at a time, usually over tea, usually with Juno on the other end of a screen trying to explain something she had never once had to put into words before. Every weave-born creature carried a thread organ, a small knot of living tissue grown into the base of the skull before birth. It did one thing, and it did it every waking moment of every life. It reached outward, and it touched the threads of every other weave mind nearby, weaving them together into a single soft hum of shared presence. Not shared thoughts. Not shared memories. Just presence, the simple, constant knowledge that you were not, and had never been, entirely alone. A Velen child grew up inside that hummed the way a human child grows up inside gravity, so completely surrounded by it that most of them never noticed it was there at all. Juno had once tried to describe it to Ada, fumbling for a comparison that didn't quite exist in human experience. It's like, she'd said, if you could always feel your own heartbeat, but it was also somehow everyone else's heartbeat too, all at once, all the time, until you stopped noticing it was even there. You'd only notice if it ever stopped. It was only when the hum stopped that a weave mind understood what it had been holding it up. They called the stopping unweaving. It began small. A creature cut off from the weave, by distance, by damage, by the simple bad luck of being posted somewhere too far from the deep threads, would first feel a kind of thinness, as though the air had gone flat. Within hours, that thinness curdled into something worse, a crawling sense that the world itself had become unreliable, that walls might not be where they seemed, that the next breath might not follow the last one the way it always had before. Within a day or two, most minds simply could not hold themselves together anymore. They folded inward, lost in a private storm no one outside could reach, sometimes for days, sometimes for good. It was why the caudral built their relay stations the way they did. Lanterns like 6 were always crewed in pairs at minimum, threaded together tightly enough to survive the gap in the wider weave, each mind propping up the other across the long dark stretch between real stars. It was slow, expensive work, training and pairing and rotating crews who could stand even that much distance from home. No single Velen had ever been sent to run a lantern alone. The very idea would have sounded, to most of them, like being asked to hold your breath forever. Which was exactly why humans had turned out to be so useful and so strange. When the first human envoys arrived in caudral space, nobody in the weave quite knew what to make of them. They had no thread organ. Norm. No shared presence humming beneath their thoughts at all. To Velen eyes, examining the scans for the first time, it looked like a terrible defect, a whole species born profoundly, permanently alone, cut off from everyone around them by the simple accident of their own biology. One of the first caudral physicians to study human brain scans had written, in a report Juno once quoted to Ada with a small, apologetic laugh, that it looked as though something essential had simply failed to grow. And yet the humans did not seem to suffer for it. Ada had been one of the first to take a posting on a lantern by herself, and she had done it not as a dare, not to prove anything, but because the pay was good and the quiet suited her. She had spent years before that tending an old weather station on the edge of a frozen sea back on Earth, months at a stretch with only the wind and her own thoughts for company, and she had found, to her own quiet surprise, that she liked it there. Some people needed a crowd around them to feel steady. Ada had always been the opposite. Give her a small space, a simple job, and enough silence to hear her own thoughts clearly, and she settled the way water settles into a still pond. The caudral assembly had been careful about it at first, running months of tests, watching her health readings the way you'd watch a patient after surgery, half expecting the same slow unraveling they saw in their own kind. A whole team of physicians had monitored her first 30 days on Lantern 9 around the clock, certain that somewhere around the 2-week mark she would begin to show the same signs they saw in their own unweaving offices. It never came. Ada tended her garden. She read old books on a small screen. She talked to herself sometimes, and laughed at her own jokes, and slept well, and after 30 days, then 60, then 104, she was, by any measure they knew how to take, entirely fine. To the Velen, that was not just surprising. It was almost impossible to believe. Juno had said as much. The first week she'd started running Ada's check-ass, her voice carrying the particular disbelief of someone watching a fish walk. "Doesn't it get to you?" she'd asked. "All that empty space around you, all the time." "It's not empty," Ada had told her. "It's just quiet. Those aren't the same thing." Juno hadn't understood then. She still didn't, not really. But she had started asking the question a little less like a diagnosis and a little more like a genuine curiosity, and Ada had noticed that too. Noticed it in the way Juno lingered a little longer on each call than the job required, in the small personal questions that crept in around the edges of the official ones. Ada had learned, over those months, a little about why the question mattered so much to Juno in particular. Juno had grown up in a large Weave household, one of 6 siblings threaded so tightly together in childhood that their parents had joked, more than once, that they could never tell whose thought was whose at the dinner table. It was a warm way to grow up, by every account Juno gave of it, full and crowded and never once quiet. But Juno had also confessed, late one evening when the conversation had wandered somewhere more honest than usual, that she sometimes wondered what she would even sound like, thinking entirely on her own, with no one else's hum blurring the edges of her own mind. "I don't think I've ever heard myself think," she'd admitted, half laughing at how strange it sounded out loud. "Not really. Not the way you seem to. Every thought I've ever had, some small part of somebody else was there for it too." "That's not a flaw either," Ada had told her. "It just means you've never had to be your own only company. Some people go their whole lives lucky enough never to need that particular skill. I don't think that makes you weaker than me. I think it just means we've each had different things asked of us." Juno hadn't said much back to that, but Ada had seen something shift behind her eyes, a small crack of curiosity opening in a wall she hadn't fully realized was there. Ada still remembered the day the testing had finally ended, 3 years ago now, when a tired but relieved physician had come to tell her, almost apologetically, that they had run out of tests to run. "We keep waiting for something to go wrong," the physician had admitted, sitting across from her in a small observation room lined with monitors that had, for 30 straight days, found nothing worth flagging. "Every marker we know how to check for unweaving, we've checked in you, over and over, and every single one comes back the same as the day you arrived. I don't know whether to call that good news or simply strange news." "Can't it be both?" Ada had asked, and the physician had laughed, the first real laugh Ada had heard from any of them in a month, and after that the tests had grown gentler, less like a search for a hidden flaw and more like simple curiosity about a puzzle nobody minded not solving right away. Now, staring at the dark screen where Juno's worried face had just been, Ada thought about that difference, quiet and empty, and wondered, for the first time, whether something out at Lantern 6 had learned the difference the hard way. By the third missed chorus check, Juno stopped pretending it was the relay line. She called Ada again that evening, and this time she didn't bother with small talk about the mint. Her hair, usually kept in a neat coil at the back of her head, had come loose on one side, and there were faint shadows under her eyes that hadn't been there that morning. "We sent a message drone out to 6, she said. "Standard procedure. It reached the station, docked clean, ran its diagnostic. Life support's fine. Power's fine. The beacon's still pulsing right on schedule." She paused, and Ada watched her throat move as she swallowed. "The crew just isn't answering the comm. Could they be hurt?" "The drone's medical scan says no. Both of them show up alive on the sensors. Vitals steady. They're just—" Juno stopped, searching for a word that didn't quite exist in the way she wanted to use it. "They're just not there. Not answering. Not moving, according to the drone's last pass through the common room. It found them sitting. Both of them. Just sitting." "That sounds like unweaving," Ada said quietly. "It can't be. Lantern 6 has a full paired crew. 2 threaded officers, boosted link, redundant backup lines. Even if the relay went down completely, they'd have each other. That's the whole point of pairing them." Juno's voice had a thin edge now, the sound of someone repeating a rule because the alternative was too frightening to say out loud. "They shouldn't be able to unweave. Not both of them. Not like this." "But you think they have?" Juno didn't answer for a long moment. On the screen, Ada could see her hands, folded tightly together, the knuckles pale. "I think something happened to the boosted link," Juno said finally. "I think whatever it was took them both down together instead of one holding the other up. And I think if that's true, there is no crew we can send in to check on them. Because any paired team we send would be walking into the same kind of gap that just swallowed the last one." She pulled up the drone's short recording and let Ada watch it once, in full. It showed little, a dim, undisturbed common room, two still shapes exactly where the scan had said they'd be, no sign of struggle, no sign of panic, nothing broken except the console lights that should have been steady and weren't. It was the stillness of it that unsettled Ada more than any wreckage could have. Whatever had happened here had not been violent. It had simply been absolute. "There's already talk in the assembly," Juno went on, "about pulling every Lantern crew back to shorter, better supported postings until we understand what happened. Some of the older counselors want to ground the whole outer relay network indefinitely. Do you understand what that would mean? Half our long-range navigation, gone dark, maybe for months, while we rebuild every link line from scratch out of fear of a fault we don't even understand yet. That's a heavy price to pay for one bad amplifier," Ada said. "It's the price of not knowing whether it was just one bad amplifier," Juno said. "That's exactly the problem. Nobody wants to send anyone else out to find out for certain." Ada thought about that for a moment, turning the shape of the problem over in her mind the way she might turn over a stuck valve, looking for the angle that would let it move. She had already, without quite meaning to, begun to see the answer sitting in plain sight. "Except me," she said. It came out before she'd fully decided to say it, the way true things sometimes do. Juno looked up sharply. No. Absolutely not. It's a 9-day run out to 6, most of it in a lane too thin for rescue backup. You'd be alone the entire way, and alone again once you got there, with a broken relay and 2 unresponsive crew and no idea what actually happened. "I've been alone for 104 days, Ada said, "and I've been fine every single one of them. That's not a boast, Juno. It's just true. Whatever hit that station, it hit the part of them that can't survive without the hum. I don't have that part. It can't touch me the way it touched them." "You don't know that." "No," Ada agreed. "But you don't know that it will, either. And right now somebody has to find out, because those 2 officers don't have 9 days to wait for a paired crew brave enough to risk what happened to them." Juno was quiet for a long time after that, long enough that Ada wondered if the connection had dropped. When she finally spoke again, her voice was smaller than Ada had ever heard it. "I don't want to be the one who sends you out there," Juno said. "I keep picturing what the drone found. That empty common room. That silence. And I keep thinking, if it's that easy to reach even a paired crew, what happens to someone who's already unwoven before she even leaves the dock?" "I was never woven in the first place," Ada said gently. "That's the part you keep forgetting. Whatever broke them, it isn't going to find anything of mine to break." It wasn't bravado. Ada didn't feel brave, sitting there in her small quiet control room with her tea gone cold beside her. She felt, if anything, the particular calm she always felt right before doing something that needed doing, the same calm she'd felt years ago, checking a weather line in a storm back on Earth, the same calm that had nothing to do with not being afraid and everything to do with knowing exactly what came next. Before she went to sleep that night, she pulled a worn notebook from a shelf above her bunk, the one she never showed anyone, and wrote 3 lines in it, the way she had almost every night for the past 104 days. She did not write about Lantern 6, not yet. She wrote about the mint, and the tea, and a joke she'd made to herself that morning that had actually been pretty funny. Small, ordinary things. The kind of things that, taken together over enough quiet nights, had taught her a long time ago that she could be alone with herself and still be good company. She closed the notebook, turned off the light, and slept well, the way she always did. The assembly argued about it for 2 full days before they agreed to let her go, and even then, Juno told her later, the vote had not been close to unanimous. Half the council had wanted to wait for a specially boosted rescue pair, train crew with the strongest possible link between them, even though everyone in the room understood that the strongest link they had was still, by definition, exactly the kind of link that had just failed. The other half had understood, faster than they wanted to admit, that Ada was offering them the only option that didn't ask 2 more people to walk into the same silence that had already taken 2. One elder counselor, a stern voice Ada never got a name for, had argued flatly that sending an unlinked human alone into a station that had already broken a full-paired crew was not bravery but recklessness dressed up in calm words, and that the assembly would be responsible for whatever became of her. In the end, it was Juno who tipped it. She stood up in front of the council, a junior officer speaking out of turn to elders 3 times her age, her voice shaking at first and then steadying as she went. "We keep talking about her like she's fragile because she's alone," Juno said. "But she isn't fragile. She's just different. And right now, different might be the only thing that can save them." They let Ada go 2 days later, in a small fast courier ship stripped down for a single pilot, carrying supplies, medical gear, and a spare relay unit in case the fault turned out to be something as simple as a burned-out line. The trip to Lantern 6 took 9 days, and Ada spent them the way she spent most of her days, steadily. She ran the ship systems checks each morning, walking the same short loop through the cramped cabin that she walked back home, out of habit more than need. She read a little each afternoon, an old paper book she'd brought from Earth years ago and never fully finished, its cover soft and furred at the corners from handling. She talked to herself sometimes, and to the ship, giving it a name halfway through the second day mostly for the company of having something to call by name. She settled, after some debate with herself, on Pip, after a dog she'd had as a child, and felt a little foolish and a little better for it. On the 3rd day, a minor fault tripped in the ship's air scrubber, a small thing, the kind of problem that would have been nothing at all with a second pair of hands to hold a panel steady while the other worked. Alone, it took her the better part of an afternoon, wedged into an access crawlspace with a headlamp and a set of borrowed tools, muttering to herself the whole time in a running commentary that was half complaint and half genuine amusement at her own predicament. She fixed it. She always did. It was, she thought afterward, not so different from the larger problem waiting for her at the end of the trip, just smaller, and with lower stakes, and nobody's life resting on the outcome but her own comfort. On the 5th day, Juno's face appeared on the comm, a full day's delay stamped on the signal by the time it reached her. "Just checking in," Juno's recorded voice said. "I know you won't get this for a while. I keep thinking about what you said. About quiet not being the same as empty." A pause, long enough that Ada could picture her searching for the right words, one hand pressed flat against the console the way she did when she was nervous. "I don't think I've ever actually been alone. Not once, my whole life. There's always been someone there, even when I couldn't see them. I don't know if I'd know how to be the way you are. I don't know if any of us would." "You'd learn," Ada said back, 2 days later, when the return signal finally reached the courier ship, knowing Juno wouldn't hear it for another full day after that. "It's not a trick, Juno. It's just a habit. You get quiet enough, long enough, and eventually you stop being afraid of what you hear in it." She meant it as comfort. She would not fully understand, until much later, how much that small exchange would matter. On the 7th day, with the old book finally finished and nothing left to read, Ada found herself doing something she hadn't planned. She opened a blank log entry and began recording a message, not to send anywhere in particular, just to have said out loud once, the way some thoughts only become real once you hear your own voice shape them. "I keep thinking about what Juno said," she told the empty cabin, watching the log's small light blink steady red as it recorded. "About never having been alone. I used to think that sounded almost nice, honestly. Never having to sit with just yourself. But I don't think it is nice, not really, not if it means you never learn you can. There's a kind of strength that only shows up when nobody's watching and nobody's helping, and if you never get the chance to find out you have it, I think that's its own kind of loss, even if it doesn't feel like one from the inside." She paused, listening to the low hum of the ship around her. "I hope I get out to 6 in time to matter. And I hope, whatever I find there, it teaches somebody something worth the trip." She saved the log without sending it, tucked it away in the ship's memory the way she tucked her notebook away each night, and went to check the systems one more time before sleep. The rest of the journey passed in the ordinary rhythm she'd built for herself, meals eaten slowly, the old book finished at last on the 7th day with a satisfaction that had nothing to do with the story and everything to do with simply seeing something through, until, on the 9th day, Lantern 6 appeared on her sensors, a dark shape hanging motionless against the deeper dark, its beacon still ticking out its slow pulse the way it always had, patient and steady, entirely unaware that anything at all had gone wrong beneath it. In the last hours before docking, Ada ran through everything she knew one more time, laying it out loud to the empty cabin the way she'd once laid out weather patterns to herself before a storm rolled in off the ice. 2 officers, unresponsive but alive. A relay fault of unknown cause. No word from either of them in 6 days. She checked her medical kit twice, checked the spare relay unit a 3rd time though she'd already checked it twice that morning, and found herself, for just a moment, wishing there was someone beside her to tell she was ready, the way sailors once said they were ready before a long crossing, not because anyone doubted it, but because saying it out loud made it feel more true. There was no one there to say it to. So she said it to the ship instead, quietly, the way she'd fallen into the habit of doing over 9 long days. "All right, Pip. Let's go see what's waiting for us." Ada docked her ship, sealed her suit, and stepped through the airlock into a silence so complete it seemed to have a texture of its own. Not the comfortable quiet of her own small station, but something colder, something that felt, for just a moment, like walking into a held breath. The common room of Lantern 6 was small, the same size as Ada's own galley back home, and in it she found the 2 officers exactly where the drone scan had placed them. They were not lying down. They were not injured, not in any way a medical scanner could easily name. They were simply sitting, one in a chair by the dead relay console and one on the floor against the wall, both with their eyes open, both entirely still, both looking at nothing at all. The stillness of it was the worst part, Ada thought, not the stillness of sleep, which has a kind of softness to it, but the stillness of something switched off mid-motion, a held pose with nobody left inside it to finish the gesture. The taller one, a broad-shouldered cordial officer with pale grey scales along his jaw, had a name badge that read Orient. The smaller one, curled tight against the wall, was young enough that Ada guessed she must have been on her very first posting. Her badge read Ket. Ada knelt in front of Orient first, checking his pulse the way the medical kit's instructions showed her, careful and slow. It beat steady, if a little too fast. His breathing was shallow but even. His eyes tracked her hand, faintly, when she moved it in front of his face, but nothing behind them seemed to register that a person was there at all. "Orient," she said quietly. "Can you hear me?" Nothing. She checked the relay console next, and found the fault fast, a boosted link amplifier, the piece of equipment meant to strengthen the thread between the 2 officers across the gap in the wider weave, had overloaded and burned out 3 nights before, right in the middle of a routine chorus check. Instead of simply going dark, it had done something crueler. In its last moments, the failing amplifier had thrown a violent surge back through the link itself, slamming both officers' threads together so hard, so briefly, and then cutting them apart so completely, that neither mind had been left with anything steady to hold on to. Not each other. Not the wider weave. Nothing at all. It was, Ada realized, very much like what would happen if you shouted directly into someone's ear and then, in the same instant, dropped them into total silence and sealed the door. The shock alone would be enough to knock the breath out of anyone. 2 officers who had never once, in their entire lives, spent more than a few minutes without that hum running quietly under their thoughts had just been thrown into total silence all at once, with no warning and no way to prepare. Ada thought of Juno's words from that first call. "I keep pointing out that empty and quiet are different," and understood, kneeling there in the wrecked common room, that whatever these 2 had fallen into was not simply quiet. It was empty in the truest, most frightening sense of the word. A silence with the shape of something torn out of it. She spent the next several hours doing the only thing she knew how to do. She checked and rechecked the spare relay unit she'd brought, confirmed it could patch the immediate power fault so the station's life support stayed steady. She moved Ket, carefully, onto one of the bunks, and wrapped a blanket around her, the same way Ada might have settled a frightened animal, slow movements, low voice, nothing sudden. She did the same for Orient, though his greater size made it slower, harder work, and she had to stop twice to catch her breath. She made tea, out of habit more than hope, and set 2 cups within reach of each of them, though neither showed any sign of noticing. And then, because she did not know what else to do, and because it was the thing she had always done in the quiet hours of her own long days, she began to talk. She told them about the mint, and the tomatoes that wouldn't stop climbing the wrong direction. She told them about a joke she'd made to herself 3 weeks ago that still made her laugh when she thought about it, something small and silly about a sock she could never find that had, weeks later, turned up folded neatly inside the garden box, as though it had simply gone to grow there. She told them, in a slow, steady, unhurried voice, about a winter on Earth she'd spent alone at a weather station on the edge of a frozen sea, about the sound the wind made against the walls at night, a long low moan that rose and fell like something breathing, about how frightening that sound had been the first week and how, by the 3rd month, it had become almost a kind of company, a voice she recognized even if it wasn't truly one. She told them about the first time she'd seen the icebreaker part in spring, a sound like the whole world cracking its knuckles, and how she'd stood on the shore and laughed out loud, alone, because there had been no one else there to see how beautiful it was, and she'd needed, badly, to make some kind of sound to match it. She told them, too, about the first week she'd spent on that frozen shore, Before she'd learned any of what the quiet could teach her, when the silence had pressed in on her exactly the way she imagined this station's silence must have pressed in on Ket and Orant, not gently, but like a hand closing slowly around something. She hadn't slept properly for 6 nights. She'd caught herself talking to the walls, to the wind, to anything that would let her hear a voice in the room, and she remembered thinking, with something close to panic, that she had made a terrible mistake taking a posting so far from anyone else. And then, on the 7th night, for no reason she could ever fully explain afterward, the fear had simply loosened its grip, not because anything outside her had changed, but because something inside her had finally settled into the shape of the silence instead of fighting it. "That's the part one wants you to hear most, if you can hear any of it," she told them, her voice low and even in the dim little room. "It gets easier. Not because the quiet gets smaller. Because you get bigger around it." She did not know if they could hear her, but she kept talking anyway, hour after hour, the way she talked to her plants, the way she talked to her ship, the way she had always filled her own silences, not because the silence frightened her, but because she liked the sound of a voice moving steadily through it, hers or anyone's. On the 2nd day, very late, when Ada had nearly lost track of how long she'd been speaking, Ket's fingers twitched against the blanket. By the 4th day, Ket could speak. It came back slowly, in small pieces, first her eyes finding Ada's face and staying there instead of sliding past it, then a single word, thin and cracked, and by the 4th morning, whole broken sentences, her voice still shaking but her mind, unmistakably, back inside itself. "You stayed," Ket said, the first full thing she managed to say. "The whole time. You just stayed." "Someone had to," Ada said, checking the readout on the medical kit again, watching Ket's vitals climb steadily towards something closer to normal. "You weren't afraid." Ada considered the question honestly before answering it, the way she tried to answer most questions. "I was worried. About you, mostly. Not about the quiet itself. The quiet's never been the frightening part, for me." Ket's eyes, still hollow but clearing fast, moved toward Orant, still and silent in the other bunk. "Is he?" "Getting there," Ada said. "Slower than you. I think the surge hit him first, harder. But his vitals are climbing too. I don't think it's a question of if anymore. Just how long." Ket managed, that afternoon, to sit up on her own for the first time, and by evening she could hold a cup of broth steady enough to drink from it without help. Small victories that Ada marked quietly to herself the way she'd once marked the first green shoot pushing up through the soil in her garden box, proof that something broken was mending itself, slow but sure. For the first time since Ada had arrived, something like hope moved across the small, wrecked common room, and for a few hours, it felt like the worst of it might already be behind them. Ada patched the spare relay unit into the main console, ran a diagnostic, watched the life support number settle into a clean, steady rhythm. She helped Ket sip water, then broth, then sit up on her own. She let herself believe, just for those few hours, that the hard part was finished. She even allowed herself, sitting on the floor with her back against the bunk, to close her eyes for a moment and simply breathe, the tight coil of the last 2 days finally loosening in her chest. Then, in the middle of the 4th night, the station's main reactor gave a long, low groan that Ada felt through the floor before she heard it, and every light in the common room flickered once, hard, and dimmed. She was at the engineering console within seconds, her heart hammering in a way it hadn't since she'd first stepped through the airlock, and what she found there made her stomach drop in a way nothing else on this trip had. The overloaded amplifier hadn't just fried the boosted link. Its final surge had also cracked a containment line deep in the reactor's core feed, a slow, hairline fracture that had been quietly widening for 4 days while everyone's attention had been fixed on the 2 unconscious officers in the next room. It was not yet critical, but it was close, and it was getting closer, and Ada's spare relay unit had nowhere near the tools or the training required to fix a reactor fault of that size. She sent an emergency signal back toward the assembly immediately, the burst carrying every detail she could compress into it. Then she did the math the way her old weather station training had taught her to, cold and clear-eyed, no flinching from the numbers. The nearest paired rescue crew, fully boosted and equipped to handle both the reactor and the 2 unweaving officers, was 6 days out at their fastest possible speed. The containment fracture, by her best rough estimate, had somewhere between 4 and 7 days before it failed completely. It was going to be close. It might not be close enough. And Orant, the officer who had gone under first and hardest, was still nowhere near strong enough to help her hold a failing reactor together, let alone survive being moved. Ada sat back from the console for a long moment, and in the sudden, heavier quiet of the room, She felt something she had not let herself feel yet on this whole long trip, the plain, honest weight of how much now rested on her, alone, in a broken station 6 days from help, with a reactor counting down and one officer still lost somewhere inside himself. She thought of her notebook, tucked in her bag by the bunk. She thought of Juno's voice, a full day delayed, saying, "I don't think I've ever actually been alone." She thought of the mint back on Lantern 9, growing steadily in its box whether she was there to see it or not. Then she stood up, wiped her hands on a jumpsuit, and went to check the reactor readings again, because sitting still and being afraid had never once, in her whole life, fixed anything, and she did not see any reason to start now. What followed was not dramatic, not in the way stories usually tell it. There was no single desperate scramble, no last-second miracle. There was simply a great deal of steady, careful, unglamorous work, stretched out across 6 long days, held together by nothing more than one woman's refusal to let the quiet inside her crack. Ada rerouted power away from every non-essential system she could find, buying the fracture more time by lowering the strain running through it. She rigged a manual coolant feed using parts from her own courier ship, working with her hands inside a narrow access panel for hours at a stretch, guided only by a technical manual she'd never read before and a growing, hard-won understanding of a reactor design that wasn't even her own species' work. Twice, in the first 2 days, her makeshift rig failed outright, coolant hissing uselessly into the wrong line while a warning tone shrilled through the station, and both times she had forced her hands to stay steady, had talked herself through the failure out loud the way she'd talked to Ket and Orant in their silence, and had simply started again. She slept in short, careful pieces, an hour here, 2 hours there, always within reach of the console's alarm, waking each time with her body already moving before her mind had fully caught up. And she kept talking. To Ket, who grew stronger every day and began, by the second day, to help with small tasks Ada guided her through, holding a light steady, passing tools, learning the shape of the fracture Ada was fighting to hold closed. To Orant, who remained silent and still, though Ada thought, she could not be certain, but she thought, that his breathing had begun to change subtly whenever she spoke near him, a fraction steadier, a fraction slower. On the third day, Ket, sitting up now and able to hold a tool steady, asked the question that had clearly been sitting in her since she first woke. "How do you do it?" she asked. "Not just here. All the time. Alone on your own station, month after month. I keep thinking about what it would take to be able to sit in a silence like the one that almost swallowed me, and just not fall apart in it." Ada considered the question while she worked, turning a valve a careful quarter turn at a time. "I think," she said slowly, "it's less about not falling apart, and more about knowing you can put yourself back together if you do. My people, we grew up without anything like your thread. No hum, no shared presence running under everything. We had to learn, a long time ago, how to be good company for ourselves, because sometimes there just wasn't anyone else around to be it for us. It's not a gift. It's more like a callus. You get it from doing the hard thing enough times that it stops being quite so hard." "That sounds lonely," Ket said quietly. "Sometimes it is," Ada admitted. "But loneliness and solitude aren't the same thing, any more than quiet and empty are. Loneliness is wanting someone there and finding no one. Solitude is just being somewhere by yourself, and being all right about it. I spent a long time learning to tell the two apart. I think that's the actual secret, if there is one. Not being unafraid of the quiet. Just knowing, all the way down, that you're still there in it." Ket didn't say anything for a while after that. But later, when Ada glanced over, she found the younger officer sitting a little straighter, watching the reactor readout with the same careful attention Ada gave it, as though trying the shape of that idea on for size. On the second day, exhaustion caught up with her in a way she hadn't expected. She fell asleep sitting upright at the engineering console, only to wake with a jolt an hour later, disoriented, her heart racing, certain for one terrible moment that she had slept through something critical. Nothing had changed. The readouts sat exactly where she'd left them. But the fright of it stayed with her the rest of that day, a reminder that steadiness was not the same as endlessness, that even she had limits worth respecting, and from then on she forced herself to set a small timer each time she rested, however briefly, so that sleep could never again catch her by surprise. On the fourth day, the fracture widened faster than Ada's models had predicted, and for nearly an hour the containment alarm did not stop, a thin, insistent whine that filled the whole small station. Ket's hand shook holding the light. Ada's own pulse ran fast and hard in her ears, and for one long, honest moment, crouched in the narrow access panel with coolant hissing somewhere close by and no way to be sure her patch would hold, She let herself feel the full size of how badly this could still go wrong. Then she breathed out, slow, the way she'd taught herself to do years ago on the ice, and reached back into the panel, and kept working. The alarm quieted an hour later. The patch held. By the 5th day, the fracture had slowed, though not stopped, and Ada's makeshift coolant feed was holding, barely, on hope and careful tending. Oren's eyes had begun, for the first time, to focus, not fully, not yet, but enough that when Ada spoke near him now, something in his face seemed to be listening. She told him, that evening, the same story about the ice breaking apart in spring that she'd told him in his silence, and thought, though she could not be sure, that one corner of his mouth moved, very slightly, the ghost of something that might one day become a smile again. On the 6th day, a fast pair of rescue lights appeared on the sensors, closing in from the deep dark, and Ada allowed herself, for the first time in 6 days, to sit down fully and simply breathe. The lights on the sensor screen did not mean the danger was over, not yet, and Ada knew it even as the first wave of relief washed through her. A rescue ship still had to cross the last stretch of dark, still had to dock, still had to make its way through a station whose corridors had not been cleared or checked in 6 days of nothing but the two of them holding on. She made herself get up from where she'd sat down, made herself walk the console one more time, because the work was not finished simply because help was close. It was Ket who nearly broke, in those last hours, not Ada. The younger officer had held herself together through 5 days of steady, careful effort, matching Ada's calm the way a plant turns to follow the sun, but as the rescue lights grew slowly brighter on the screen, something in her seemed to loosen all at once, the way a held muscle sometimes only starts to shake once the danger has actually passed. What if they're too late anyway? Ket said quietly, staring at the readout, her voice thin. What if we did all this, and it still wasn't enough? Ada crouched down beside her, the way she had crouched beside Orent on that first terrible day, and did not offer her a comforting lie. Then it still would have been worth doing, she said. Every hour we bought was an hour that mattered, whether or not it turns out to be the last one we needed. You don't get to know the ending in advance, Ket. Nobody ever does. You just do the next right thing, and then the one after that, for as long as it takes. That's a hard way to live, Ket said. It's the only way I've ever found that actually works, Ada said, and something in the plainness of it seemed to steady the younger officer more than any reassurance could have. They waited together after that, not speaking much, listening to the station's tired systems hum around them, watching the 2 small lights on the screen grow slowly larger. Orent stirred once, in the middle of that long wait, his eyes opening fully for the first time, finding Ket's face across the room and holding there, and though he said nothing yet, Ket made a small sound, half a laugh and half something closer to tears, and reached for his hand. When the rescue ship's docking clamp finally locked against the station's hull with a heavy metallic thud, Ada felt the sound travel up through the floor and into her own chest, and only then did she let the last of the tension go, sitting back against the wall exactly where Ket had once been curled in the terrible stillness of that first day, and closing her eyes, just for a moment, to rest. The rescue team stabilized the reactor within hours of arriving, their trained hands making short work of a fracture Ada had spent 6 days holding together with spare parts and stubbornness. Orent was moved to proper medical care and, within a week, was speaking again, slowly, his own long climb back still ahead of him but no longer in doubt. Ket, remarkably, chose to stay at Ada's side through the entire transfer, refusing every offer to be moved first. News of what had happened at Lantern 6 spread through the caudral assembly quickly, the way news of a near disaster always does, but it did not spread the way Ada expected. There was no great public spectacle, no crowd gathering to watch something impossible happen in front of them. It moved instead through quieter channels, mission logs, medical reports, the careful, precise language of officers filing accounts of what they had seen. And in every one of those accounts, the same plain facts sat at the center. A single unlinked human, alone, had walked into a silence that had already broken 2 trained, paired officers, and had not only survived it, but had held 2 lives and a failing station together inside it for 6 days, simply by staying steady. The assembly convened a review 2 weeks later, not a spectacle, not a vote before a packed chamber, but a small working session in a plain grey room, the kind of meeting where real decisions actually got made. Juno was there, seated near the back, her hands folded tightly in her lap. So was Ket, still pale but steady, insisting on speaking for herself despite the physician's advice that she rest longer. Ada sat quietly to one side, answering questions when they were asked of her and saying little otherwise, which suited her fine. An older counselor named Vess, whose scales had gone the deep blue-grey of long age, studied Ada for a long moment before he spoke. We built our whole civilization around the belief that a mind cannot survive without another mind close beside it, he said. We have spent generations treating isolation as something to be prevented at almost any cost. And here you are, having proven, about as thoroughly as it is possible to prove anything, that at least one kind of mind can carry that weight entirely alone, and can even carry someone else's weight along with it. He paused. I confess I do not fully understand how. A second counselor, sharper-voiced, leaned forward before Ada could answer. With respect, counselor, understanding it is precisely the point. We cannot simply be grateful and move on. If this human's biology allows what ours cannot, we need to know the shape and the limits of that difference before we build any policy around it. What happens if we send an unlinked volunteer somewhere even harder, and this time it isn't enough? I don't have a tidy answer for that, Ada said honestly. I'm not going to pretend I know the exact edge of what I can carry. I only know what I've carried so far, and that I'd rather find the edge carefully, with proper support, than have someone find it by accident, the way Ket and Oren found the edge of what your own people can carry. The sharper-voiced counselor sat back, apparently satisfied by the honesty of it, if not entirely comforted. A third voice spoke up from the far side of the chamber, quieter, more thoughtful. There is also the matter of what we owe her, and any human who follows her, if we ask this of them again. It cannot simply be a service we call on in emergencies and otherwise ignore. If we are going to lean on this difference, we had better be prepared to build something lasting around it, not just be grateful once and move on. Vess nodded slowly at that, as though the words had settled something he had been turning over in his own mind since the review began. I don't think you're supposed to fully understand it, Ada went on, turning back to Vess. I don't think I could fully explain what it's like to grow up threaded to everyone around you, either. We are just built differently. That's not a flaw in either of us. It just means we are useful for different things. Useful, Vess repeated, turning the word over slowly. Yes. I believe you may be right about that. Ket spoke then, for the first time in the session, her voice still thin but steady. I want to say something, if I may. Vess nodded for her to continue. I was there. I felt what took me under, even if I can't describe it well. And I felt her, later, pulling me back out of it, just by staying and talking, hour after hour, with nothing to gain from it and every reason to be afraid herself. I don't think we should study her like a puzzle to be solved. I think we should be asking what she can teach the rest of us, if we are willing to learn it slowly, the way she learned it. An old relay engineer named Torek, who had spent 40 years maintaining lantern stations and had never once believed an unlinked human could hold a post alone, came to find Ada in the corridor outside the chamber once the session broke. He was a heavy-set corporal with a permanent stoop from decades bent over engineering consoles, and he stood in front of her for a moment before he spoke, as though working up to something he wasn't used to saying. I told the review board, 3 years back, that letting a human crew a lantern alone was a mistake waiting to happen, he admitted. I said it plainly, more than once. I want you to know I was wrong, and I want to know how you did what you did out there, because I intend to teach it to every engineer who'll listen. I'm not sure it's something that can be taught exactly, Ada said, but I'm happy to try explaining it, if you've got the patience for a long answer. Torek managed a short, dry laugh. Patience, he said, is something we are all going to have to get a great deal better at, it seems, one way or another. He shook her hand, an unfamiliar cordial gesture he performed a little awkwardly, having clearly practiced it beforehand, and went back inside to help draft the very protocol he'd have argued against a month earlier. What came out of that small grey room was not a grand welcome, not a formal declaration before the stars. It was something quieter and, in its way, more lasting, a new protocol, drafted within the month, allowing trained human volunteers to serve as solo emergency responders for any lantern station cut off from its link, with proper support and proper pay, their steadiness no longer treated as an oddity to be studied but as a genuine, valued skill, the same as any pilot's steady hands or any engineer's careful eye. Juno was the one who told Ada, weeks later, that the council had quietly begun a second program alongside the first, not for humans this time, but for Velen volunteers, young officers curious enough, and steady enough, to try short, carefully supervised stretches of solitude of their own, guided step by exactly the people who already knew how to survive it. I signed up for it, Juno admitted, a little sheepishly, over their now regular comm call. Just a few hours at first. It's harder than I expected. I keep waiting for the hum to come back, and when it doesn't, some old part of me still wants to panic. And does it? Ada asked. Sometimes, Juno said. But less than it used to. I think about what you said. That it's not about not being afraid. It's about knowing you're still there, even in the quiet. She smiled, and this time it reached all the way to her eyes. I think I finally understand what you meant, about quiet and empty not being the same thing. Chapter 10. The Second 90 Seconds. A year later, Lantern 9 looked much the same as it always had. The same squat metal drum, the same long antenna reaching into the dark, the same steady, patient pulse ticking out across the stars. The min had finally been trimmed back into something like good behavior. The tomatoes had given up climbing sideways and, for reasons Ada still hadn't worked out, decided to grow properly at last, as though they too had finally learned something about steadiness. Ada's life had changed in small, quiet ways since the review. She still tended her own station most months, but twice now she had been called out to sit with other crews caught in smaller versions of what had happened at Lantern 6. A frayed link here, a frightened young officer there, and each time, she had done what she had always done. She had stayed. She had talked. She had let the quiet do its slow, patient work. She was kneeling in the garden box, dirt under her fingernails, humming an old tune, when the comm chimed behind her. It was Ket's face on the screen this time, no longer pale, no longer hollow-eyed, standing not in the medical bay but in the small control room of a lantern of her own, Lantern 6 itself, fully repaired, and, at Ket's own quiet insistence, now crewed by a single volunteer at a time, on carefully monitored rotation, the way Ada had proven it could be done. First solo shift, Ket said, holding up the comms so Ada could see the familiar, no longer frightening room behind her. 12 hours in. I wanted you to be the one I told. How does it feel? Ada asked. Ket considered the question seriously, the way Ada had once watched her consider a valve, a careful quarter turn at a time. Quiet, she said finally. Not empty. Just quiet. She smiled, small and steady. I think I finally understand the difference. Ada smiled back, and for a moment neither of them said anything more, content to simply sit together across all that distance, two steady voices holding easily in a silence that, once, had nearly swallowed one of them whole. Juno had visited Lantern 9 once, not long before, riding along on a routine supply run mostly, she admitted, so she could see for herself the small quiet place Ada had described so many times over so many calls. She had stood in the garden box's doorway for a long while, saying nothing, watching Ada trim the mint back with the same unhurried care she brought to everything, and afterward she had asked, a little shyly, if she might sit there a while by herself before the supply ship left again. Ada had shown her how to set the small timer, the same trick she'd learned the hard way on Lantern 6, and had left her alone in the garden room with the grow light humming steady overhead. She'd checked on her an hour later and found Juno sitting cross-legged on the floor, eyes closed, not unweaving, not unraveling, just breathing, slow and even, in a quiet she had chosen for herself instead of one that had been forced upon her. When Juno opened her eyes and saw Ada in the doorway, she hadn't looked frightened at all. She had looked, Ada thought, a little like someone who had just found a room inside their own house they never knew was there. Somewhere far behind Ket, on the edge of Lantern 6 small control room, the beacon gave its slow, familiar pulse, patient and unbroken, counting out the dark the way it always had, no longer a silence anyone needed to fear, but simply a quiet, doing exactly what quiet was always meant to do.